Want to make your own podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easy, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money. All in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters. Here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I feel like I have an outlet for the creativity and ideas I want to share with the world. I recommend you give it a try. We all have a voice, so share it with the world. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app, or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started today.
So yeah, they have a legal right, and I don't think the Hebrews knew, but God, if they follow God's direction, He was setting them up for success, and they might not have known the reasons why He commanded those things, but it was if they didn't get destroyed, if they didn't get out of the camp, those demonic entities that were tied to the idols and the altar and all that stuff, they had legal right. You could do all the praying you want. They're not going to go. It needed to be destroyed to break that, because yes, there was going to be an influence, an evil influence on the people in that land, in that camp, in that surrounding area, wherever those artifacts, the altar, the idols were, that was going to be a curse to them.
Welcome to the Days of Noah podcast, where we talk all things biblical, supernatural, and strange. My name is Pete. My brother Luke and I are going to discuss the Canaanite altars, an interview with Tim Bence done by Rob Skiba maybe about a decade ago. Now, Tim is an intercessor of the Lord who was dealing with these ancient Canaanite Nephilim altars around the world. And it's really just fascinating to see how the Genesis 6 event, the sin of the Watchers and their progeny, the Nephilim, continues to affect the world.
Hey, I guess we're doing this.
Yeah, brother. How are you?
I'm good.
Excellent. Did you have a chance to listen to the Tim Bence interview or get familiar with it?
Yeah, I thought it was excellent. Very impressed. I don't think I've heard him speak. So yeah, hearing the details of Jekyll Island and how the Lord led him there and everything, and the previous testimony was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's something I had come across many years ago because I had gotten into things from Rob Skiba. I was a fan of his stuff, and what's cool about Rob is and poor guy passed away during COVID. Don't know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he was only, I think, in his 40s, maybe. Yeah, another casualty of that wasn't Doug Riggs? Didn't he get sick during that same time?
Yeah, and Russ Dizdar and his wife.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the world lost a lot of awesome leaders.
A
lot of wisdom. But yeah, what's cool about Rob is, like, from my understanding, he never had like a credentialed kind of scholarly, background, but he was just more of a passionate lay leader, like a researcher that just kind of blazed his own path. And then he ends up, teaching at seminars and conferences and stuff like that because he digs into all these weird topics.
Yeah, I haven't done any research on him at all. And the Tim Bence, I think the first time I heard his name was when Dr. Laura Sanger brought him up in her research dealing with Jekyll Island. So
she heard the very same interview that we're going to be talking about. That's what set her on her journey, which was really cool. Yeah, so I kind of went ahead because I think we'll probably get into it in the next couple weeks, but I went ahead and revisited her Blurry Creatures episodes where she was a guest, and there's 2 of them that are back-to-back, and that's how she said she got into this whole topic of Nephilim and the Federal Reserve that she wrote a book about, was that very interview that we're going to talk about today. So that's really cool.
And I don't know when this conversation took place. The YouTube says 5 years ago. I think it was further, because I think in that conversation was around the time or shortly after the recession, 08, 09.
Yep. My guess is like 2014, something in there. Yeah, so let's get into that. So Tim Bence doing an interview with Rob Skiba, and we're estimating maybe 10 years ago, talking about Nephilim altars and how he dealt with those spiritually, and the way as an intercessor of the Lord he was led to deal with these things. So he starts his story talking about some of the things that he was dealing with spiritually over in, I guess, the Middle East. And he talks about God revealing to him these Canaanite altars and how he was able to deal with them spiritually and break them, sometimes physically, sometimes spiritually, breaking them so that they didn't have power anymore. And apparently these are altars that were not dealt with properly. And he gets into that in the interview about how if we had dealt with these altars properly, we probably wouldn't be having these issues today, because Israel was given very specific instructions how to deal with these things. So one of the points he mentions is just a spiritual binding over people due to legal access in the spiritual world. In this case, it was due to an ancient item of Nephilim iniquity, these altars. And I have in my notes here just a mention about Laura Sanger's Nephilim traits that she talks about. And she's got a whole list of specific traits or qualities where she calls it kind of a Nephilim host, where you're basically in line. You might not genetically have Nephilim traits, but you may be involved in a sinful pattern that makes you aligned with that type of objective, I guess.
Yeah, a willing participant, I
right.
would maybe describe it as. So it's your will, your actions that are lining up with. It's the sin that you're willing to commit,
mm-hmm.
and the lines you're willing to cross, which we know is opening yourself up to demonic activity. And maybe these individuals know they're opening themselves up, and they're desiring more power, demonic power, or maybe they're not really understanding it all, but they're still willing to engage in these things. And then, we see the byproducts or the reaping of what they sown, even generations later.
Right. Yeah, and she outlines 4 specific iniquities that can have a defilement of the land, and so she calls it spiritual mapping, where she has been able to connect with people who have a gift of discernment, where they're able to have kind of a word of knowledge from God about a particular geographic region in order to discern what type of defilement has happened on the land that continues to affect the people in that region to this day. And if I can recall off the top of my head those four things, there was idolatry, there was, I think, like a sexual perversion, there was breaking of covenant, and then there was like violence in terms of blood sacrifice, that kind of thing.
Would that be in her book under maybe the chapter classification as a Nephilim host?
So I think the Nephilim host traits are more broad than that. This was, and she goes into detail on that in the interview with Blurry Creatures hosts. But I believe the spiritual mapping had to do with these four particular areas that had to do with a defilement of the land. The Nephilim host traits are more broad. There's more than four. And she does have a subsection where there's like, I think maybe 5 or 6 that are really serious, like kind of the ones I just mentioned, where she says if you have any 2 of those, then you are considered being a Nephilim host. And then she has kind of maybe lesser important ones where if you have any 4, I think she said. We'll save that for another time because I don't have that list in front of me. But yeah, you're on the right track there. That's what she's identifying. So yeah, so in this course of events, there were archaeologists who were working overseas in Middle East area, I believe, and Tim Bence got connected with them, and they said, hey, we've discovered what looks like an altar, and this was in like a known Canaanite city over there. And I want to just look up real quick how God said to deal with these altars as he's bringing his people into the promised land and dealing with these Nephilim tribes. So in Deuteronomy 7, it's about driving out the nations. It says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Okay, those are all Nephilim infiltrated or humans willing to mate and breed with Nephilim. 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. So that's the harem. Make no treaty with them. Show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you are to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, burn their idols in the fire. And later on it says in the same chapter, the images of their gods you are to burn in the fire. Do not covet the silver and gold on them, and do not take it for yourselves, or you will be ensnared by it. And I think what's interesting there is not only is God being very practical and saying, hey, this will be a temptation if you take this little gold statue, that you will be wanting to worship it. But as we've talked about, spiritual demonic forces can inhabit these things. And so I wonder too if God's like preventing his people from being ensnared that way. Like, not the temptation to necessarily worship it, but, well, that plus the idea of these things being able to have influence, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, they have a legal right, and I don't think the Hebrews knew, but if they follow God's direction, he was he was setting them up for success, and they might not have known the reasons why he commanded those things, but it was if they didn't get destroyed, if they didn't get out of the camp, those demonic entities that were tied to the idols and the altar and all that stuff, they had legal right. You could do all the praying you want, and they're not going to go. That it needed to be destroyed to break that, because yes, there was going to be an influence, an evil influence on the people in that land, in that camp, in that surrounding area, wherever those artifacts, the altar, the idols were, that was going to be a curse to them.
Right. What's that? There's a particular story where someone in Israel did that. Do you recall? They brought it back in their tent, and then they had curses on them. They lost battles or something, and then it came to light that this person brought that thing back. Do you remember that story?
I'd have to double check, but I'm thinking it might have been Jericho. Something that was supposed to have been eradicated completely, but then was taken into the camp, probably because they coveted the gold that was on the statue. It might have been Jericho, but yeah, I do remember that story.
Well, and even with was it Jacob? Rachel took back something like Laban's house gods or something. She took back into her tent, and he goes, "Oh, well, whoever did that needs to die." And she ended up dying in childbirth after that. So his words pronounced a curse on her, and he didn't even know it was her at the time.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that story, and I'm also thinking of another one where they went into a new territory. The Israelites did, so they're inhabiting homes and dwellings of another nation, lineage of the Nephilim, where they're serving other pagan gods, and there was something described like almost like this, I want to say red or green. It was something that was going to appear on the walls, that if you resided in this dwelling place, there was going to be a sign, a supernatural sign, that something was on the property that needed to be cleansed. And if you saw those certain things, you were supposed to go to the priest. The priest was going to go, and they were basically going to systematically cleanse the property, and if necessary, tear down the walls, tear down the foundation, find those artifacts that are defiling that property that you're inhabiting, because they're going into somebody else's home that had been defiled.
Okay.
And God was giving them a sign and a wonder that they could see with their eyes, show to the priest, so they could get to the root of the issue.
Wow. And
it could be broken, cleansed, and then they won't be cursed. They could get out, so that was kind of another interesting story that popped into my head. I don't remember. So there's many, many examples in the Old Testament of God directing them to do that, and examples of them doing it properly or not doing it properly.
And the results thereof. I keep coming back to that verse, "My people perish for lack of knowledge," and just how true that is, like not having an understanding of these spiritual laws and the ways of God, and we think that we can do things differently and not have those consequences. Yeah, you were right. It is about Jericho. So in Joshua 7, Achan is punished for stealing from the Lord. And it says, the Lord had said that everything in Jericho belonged to him, but Achan from the Judah tribe took some of the things from Jericho for himself. So maybe this wasn't I thought it was like an idol or something he took, but but later in the chapter it says, he confesses, Joshua says, Achan, the Lord God of Israel, has decided you are guilty. Tell me what you did and don't try to hide anything. And he says, it's true, I sinned and disobeyed the Lord God. While we were in Jericho, I saw a beautiful Babylonian robe, 200 pieces of silver, and a gold bar. I wanted them, so I took them.
I don't know if that story in particular, now that you're giving more details on it, had to do with the pagan images, the other gods on the artifacts. I think that one had more to do with, this was like the first nation or first enemy tribe, however you want to word it, that they crossed into, the first battle that the Lord gave them victory over, and it was almost like a first fruits. Like, not only did he not want the defilement of that practice that was taking place in Jericho to come into the camp, but it was almost like, I'm not letting you have any of the spoils, even spoils that you could have, because all of this is mine. So basically, destroy it all, leave it alone. I'm going to bless you in other ways in the future as far as spoils are concerned. And it was an act of disobedience because obviously he didn't follow God's direction. But it was like a first fruits offering to the Lord, since he had, provided that victory for him. So, yeah, I don't know if that one had to do with the idols.
Not so much idols,
so much
just
then.
disobedience. But what it's saying
Right.
here, so let's see here. But there was a judgment that happened, a lack of protection that God had. So Joshua sent these spies to Ai, which is east of Bethel, and they say to Joshua, they report back, you don't need to send the whole army. 2,000 or 3,000 troops will be enough. Why bother to send the whole army for a town that small? So Joshua sends 3,000. But the men of Ai fought back and chased the Israelite soldiers away from the town gate. 36 Israelite soldiers were killed, and the army left discouraged. And Joshua and the leaders tore their clothes, put dirt on their heads to show their sorrow, and lay face down in the ground in front of their in front of the sacred chest until sunset. And then Joshua inquires of the Lord, did you bring us across the Jordan River just so the Amorites could destroy us? And the Lord answers, stop lying on the ground, get up. I said everything in Jericho belonged to me and had to be destroyed. That's what you said. But the Israelites have kept some of the things for themselves. They stole from me and hid what they took, and they lied about it. And so that's why they didn't have the victory. So just kind of tying in the influence of disobedience to God's blessing and protection and all of that. So this altar, Tim Bence says, was 18 feet by 8 inches thick. 18 feet by 8 feet thick of granite. Now, he doesn't say, that's two of the dimensions. He doesn't give the third dimension. But we can imagine that this would be considered a monolith, probably hundreds of tons. So very much in line with the Nephilim construction that we see in these different places, that we're not sure how they cut these, how they move these things, right?
Right. Now, did he mention, I don't remember the location, was it the Middle East where he was?
Yeah, this was in the Middle East.
Okay.
And so he's talking about how these altars can have a direct effect on crime and other problems in the area, like human trafficking and breaches of a country's border. That a lot of these problems can often be tied to this idolatry that's been allowed to remain, sometimes unknown, under the ground. It basically creates that spiritual environment on the land to give demonic freedom. So again, the archaeologists identified that altar as part of a known Canaanite city, and that's where I assume that this was a place Israel was probably meant to destroy but did not. And so it makes me wonder, could this ancient evil have been dealt with thousands of years ago if they'd have just listened to God's command and continued to carry out what they were supposed to? And yet here it was, in our time, still having evil influence, or at least it did when it was uncovered. That was kind of interesting that things started to happen. Like he was saying, some of these archaeologists were getting sick when they came in contact with this thing. And then I wonder, is our authority as believers limited if we don't deal with altars such as this? That these spiritual laws that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's kind of interesting. I don't understand the specifics, but you mentioned how things got worse when it was uncovered. So it's almost like when it was covered and hidden and under the dirt or wherever it happened to be, I don't know if the problems were necessarily there. Maybe they were, but it's once it was understood that, okay, this is in your face, now you got to do something with it. Now you're presented with a choice.
All right.
Do you put it in a museum? Do you, cherish it and be very sensitive to it because it's old? Or do you follow God's directive? And when you choose poorly, there is poor, effects. You mentioned them getting sick and other things going on. So, yeah, very interesting.
The archaeologists wanted to preserve it as a important artifact of antiquity. You're exactly right, and that's kind of why I brought up those verses about do not desire the gold and silver in them, and utterly destroy these altars. Yeah, we can't be valuing something that God abhors and is going to create lots of problems if it's not dealt with biblically. The other thing that's interesting, so I don't want to skip too far ahead of it, but basically there was this little 3-year-old kid who has this amazing spiritual gift of intercession and worship and everything, and here they have this this giant storm cloud come in near this altar, and they see like a demonic face, and this little child picks up a stone, almost like David and Goliath, and throws it at the cloud. And they hear like this shock wave, this sonic boom, like a cracking of a tree. And that was the sign that this altar was spiritually destroyed. And then the little child starts praising God because he knows what had happened. And Tim mentions our children as quivers. I'm sorry. Tim mentions as arrows in our quiver are our children. And it's interesting just how much spiritual warfare this little child was able to do. And you kind of contrast that with, we put kids in Sunday school and give them little, pictures to color with Noah and the animals and the ark and stuff. And it's like, we almost kind of dumb down some of this stuff. And they mention in this interview, just how sensitive children can be to things spiritually that sometimes we miss.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, I think we fail in that accord. I've even heard, and I had a friend of mine who had a granddaughter that was this way when she was very young. She was very sensitive to the spiritual realm. She was getting dreams. She was seeing things in the spiritual realm, and that kind of dissipated as the older she got and the more worldly she got. But it was that young age of innocence that she really had that sensitivity. But yeah, if you have the wisdom as an adult to train up the children in not limit them because they're a child, but treat them as a tool unto the Lord, and the Lord blesses them with spiritual gifts and things like that. Yeah, there's no age limit on when they can't be effective.
Right.
Their prayers are just as powerful.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, and
so
there's things that they can do that sometimes we can't. I can't remember if it was this interview, but I remember hearing about, children going into these war-torn areas of Africa, going into these enemy tribes that are just violent as can be, and being able to have a spiritual influence and help talk about the love and truth of Jesus there. And the adults definitely wouldn't have been able to go in there and do that. They would have been killed for sure, but the children were able to go in there and do that. And so they said that once this altar was broken spiritually, that it wasn't long after that it started to crumble. And so it was almost like there was a demonic preservation of this stone for thousands of years, and then it started to fall apart. And there's a lot of parallels that came to mind when I thought of that. Number one is you think of Lord of the Rings with Gollum, and it says, the ring gave Gollum unnatural long life, right? And or I think of William Schneblin, who used to be a Satanist, and how he, according to him, he says he lived on nothing but blood for a whole year. So there was a demonic preservation that was going on, that once that power was broken, the stone started to crumble. And Tim also gets into this idea of boundaries, and this is what I kind of phrase it as, that not all sin is equal. That like he brings up the sin of rape. Like before it's a sexual sin, it's a boundaries sin. It's you're willing to cross a boundary that should be in place. And so I think both Tim and Rob Skiba were suggesting kind of where I'm leaning as far as how did the Nephilim resurgence happen, through likely Ham's son Canaan, that Noah cursed after Ham's sin. So Ham broke a boundary, not just a sin, but he actually crossed a boundary, and I think that's where, we're talking about these Nephilim traits and being a host. That's where you're like willingly opening yourself up, and you just shake your fist at God and say, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Laura Sangler, she, even though this is just a hypothesis on her part, definitely not a official clinical diagnosis or anything as far as classification of a Nephilim host, but the types of sins that she documents in her book, that if someone willfully does these things, you're just, it's you're opening yourself up to it's not just a baby lie. It's not just a little act. I mean, it is, like you said, premeditated, and deeper consequences lie there, when you commit some of these things.
Yeah, and so that's where I kind of agree with that idea of the Nephilim returning through Ham's son Canaan, and of course Dr. Laura talks about epigenetics and having basically a genetic trait that can be turned on and off, as epigenetics, the study of, is uncovering. And so there may have been a recessive trait that genetically that maybe Ham's wife had.
Yeah, I don't know if I really agree with that theory. I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis. I almost wonder if it's not so much a dormant gene, but as we know, when we're of the lineage, all of humanity is of the lineage of of Adam and Eve. So once that initial sin curse is in our genetics, is in our bloodline, we're born into it. That's where we're in need of a savior from the time we're born. So we're already predisposed to go. You don't have to teach a child to lie.
Sure.
Or, have bad behavior.
Yeah.
It's in their character to do the wrong things. But by our free will, coupled with that, I think that's what leads to these things. I don't know that I really agree that it's a hidden DNA type of thing, turning on, turning off. I think it's more if you willfully do evil, sinful, and like you were saying, there's levels to the severity of the consequences of certain sin. Like Dr. Laura says, talking about trafficking of humans or eating of human flesh, cannibalism,
right,
blood, that type of, murder, these really, really, and I think even Pastor Doug Riggs talked about Hitler on how he qualified to reach a certain level, almost like a Nephilim host,
okay,
because of his willful blood, of the willful evil that he did. So it wasn't a genetic thing. It was the iniquity force that he was willing to do. He received additional power, evil power.
No, I would agree with that, and I think we can't be too dogmatic about it and say, oh, so and so had a Nephilim DNA, therefore they can't be saved, or therefore they're going to be super evil or something like that. Yeah, it's a willingness of your spirit to involve, and even some of the Blurry Creatures episodes talking about shapeshifters, where the initiation of that is that killing has to take place. There's a blood sacrifice that has to take place. So yeah, I think that willingness of one's spirit, perhaps independent of DNA, is the main issue. But I'm referring to more of the genetic line of Nephilim, of the human-angel hybridization that perhaps was evident. Because we're talking about, again, these Canaanite tribes that were of great stature and strength. So it wasn't merely their iniquity and their evil, right? There was also physical qualities that normal human DNA doesn't possess. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and obviously the scripture talks about Nimrod. So if you're talking about the cursed line of Ham, which and turned into being the Canaanites, which led to Nimrod, and that the scripture says he began to be something different.
Yeah, a Gibor.
So is it possible that he was fully human, but his generation, his family tree, was cursed? There was a verbal curse that Noah did on the offspring. Plus, there's the iniquity force of this sin from passed on, because it talks about the sins of the forefathers being passed on. That if the sin has not been dealt with, and you continue to, generations before me committed certain sins, and then nobody deals with the sin, and the acts and the evil just gets greater and greater and greater, and now it's built up to my choice and my free wills. And maybe that's when, if I'm willing to participate in all of that and not deal with the generational stuff and have my own free will that's committing evil, maybe genetically I could potentially change into something different, even on a molecular cellular DNA level. That's what appears took place with Nimrod.
Yeah, I think that's a viable hypothesis. But I also, again, like I said, I also wonder if it's sometimes it's both. It's both the iniquity that you're willing to put yourself in, but then in some cases there's also actually that passed on DNA that's there too. But yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, so in kind of the general sense, like these sin issues can persist when these altars are not dealt with. And the idolatry has the ability to permeate the atmosphere of a geographic region and the people of that region. And so a lot of times, like we said, when there's major problems in the world with sin and evil, it's often associated with idolatry. And so when God was driving out the Nephilim from these lands, it was not just about judgment. It was about restoring that land that had been defiled. And so Rob Skiba mentions seeing an animation of showing world wars throughout the history. And the animation on the world map was showing like little explosions where wars were happening. And if it was a bigger war, it would show a bigger explosion in the animation. And he said it was incredible how many of these things were happening in the area that's now Germany. And so what's interesting is that when these giant tribes, the Nephilim tribes, were being driven out of the land, because not all of them were killed, but a lot of times they were driven out from the lands that the Israelites were being given by God, many of them did settle in Germany. And that might be why Germany is so involved in world wars and the atrocities that were committed there, was because of a lot of these. And I believe Tim Bence says that he knew of at least 12 Canaanite altars. And he, at the time of the interview with Rob, he said he had dealt with 3 of them, destroyed 3 of them. But there was at least 12 that he had identified.
Yeah, that's interesting to wonder, where did they all go? I think L.A. Mazzulli had found some writing on an artifact in Ohio or someplace here in the States, that made reference to the Canaanites. And I know we haven't got into it yet, and we probably will, because it was in that interview about Jekyll Island. So that's off the coast of Georgia. So here in the States, Canaanite connection. I think, didn't he mention also, going back to Germany, and it's kind of interesting if you think of Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark episode. Yep. They were desiring some ancient artifacts, which it happened to be the Ark of the Covenant, in the goal of empowering their armies. So even though it was that, changed the narrative to a Canaanite altar, which I think Tim referenced, that before World War II, there was some altars that were maybe shipped in, brought to Berlin.
Yes, good segue. I was just going to get to there. The seed of Satan, or an altar of Zeus, is often been called the seed of Satan. And in the book of Revelation, it talks about this in Pergamum, which I guess is in Turkey. But I was able to pull up an article because, Tim and Rob do talk a little bit about this. So let me just grab this article I found that talks a little bit about it. So, yeah.
And didn't they say there was one that was in Berlin that was replicated by Obama? Or brought in by Obama?
Yeah. So that is correct. So Satan's throne moved to Berlin. So you have the ancient city of Pergamum, which was in Turkey. And then, let's see. It was one of the most influential cities of the Roman Empire and a center of worship for the Roman emperor, who is believed to be part god and part human. So there we have the demigods of Nephilim descent. There was a temple for worshiping the war god Athena, or war goddess. But most important, an altar in the city was the great altar of Zeus, which is mentioned as the throne of Satan in the book of Revelation. To the angel of the church in Pergamum write, I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. And so, okay, here we go. In 1878, the German engineer Karl Humann, I don't know why I said Humann, Karl Humann, started to dismantle the altar of Zeus from the long-abandoned city of Pergamum and took it to Berlin. The altar was stored until the building of a new museum in Berlin started in 1910. Well, how about that? World War I started not long after, right? Due to war and economic depression in Germany, the museum was not open for visitors until 1930. And, of course, if you know a little bit about World War I, the peace deal that Germany was forced to make because they were getting whooped, basically left their country economically devastated. That's where you have the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany, right? Where you had like a wheelbarrow full of marks and it could barely buy a loaf of bread. Yeah, they were devastated, and so that was the situation that was ripe for a charismatic leader like Hitler to come to power. Which incidentally the US helped finance. Not to go down that rabbit trail too much, but yeah. The great altar of Zeus, or the throne of Satan, that some people call it, went on display in Berlin's Pergamum Museum in 1930 with the reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate of ancient Babylon. The Ishtar Gate is also known as the Gates of Hell. Oh, just incredible, these ties. So,
well, and as we've heard before, not just dealing with the altars, which maybe the occultic practice that is known by Hitler and the Nazi power that they were practicing in. It makes you wonder, were they doing those things in connection with or around those certain altars that they brought into the nation?
Ritually. So Tim does mention that. Let me see if I can find it here. Okay, so there was an altar of the Black Sun in Germany, and they said that this is where the Nazi officers, they used this location of the altar of the Black Sun as the location for their officers, the SS officers' initiation. So
that's the one that he was talking about, that was basically a castle was built on top of it.
Oh, sure. Yep.
And yes, the SS were initiated some kind of manner. However, they did that. Yeah. They made oaths and stuff.
Incredible, just like we were talking about, willingness to cross boundaries.
But there was also, I mean, if you were to go this path, by them participating and making covenant with the darkness, that they did, which are tied to these altars, which are tied to their occultic practices, they literally were opening up portals. They were making exchanges with powers that they didn't realize that they couldn't control, and part of the benefit that they received was cutting edge technology. You know, that explains in part why they were so far advanced the rest of the world, is because they were willing to basically sell their souls in exchange for this technology. And as we know, that after the war with Operation Paperclip, some of those same researchers,
Nazi officers,
got scattered around the world, even into the United States and the NASA projects and
form NASA, CIA.
So it's far-reaching, and it definitely didn't end at World War II. But to hear how Tim was used of the Lord to strategically go to different places on the planet and find these altars and to fulfill his mandate that you described in Deuteronomy, was such a powerful interview. Probably one of the best I've heard in a while.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'm going to keep trying to find him online because like I said, there's another guy with his name, and that's all that pops up when I search for him. So I don't know if he's even still around. Yeah, so he's dealing with these altars over in the Middle East and Germany. I think there was one in Germany that he talks about where there was a group of witches that said publicly they were going to travel there to this altar, and they were going to invite the ancient gods to come back. And
that was an interesting story.
Yep, and Tim and his fellow Christians over there basically said to them in no uncertain terms, yeah, not only don't do this because you're going to bring judgment on the land, but in the name of God, no. Like, you are not allowed. And there was and they replied, oh no, we come in peace and this will be good, and all that. They're trying to make it sound like it was a beneficial thing. And then at some point there was like one of them that was encouraging another witch to say, hey, you've got to go do this, you got to get this done. And so then that one got sent there, and Tim says that she developed health issues when she tried to go there and do this, incantation or whatever, and she almost died. And I think it said that they met with her in the hospital and talked to her about it, and she didn't like convert to Christianity or anything at that point, but she realized what she was doing was against God, and she repented and said, okay, I'm not going back.
Yeah, they even prayed for her,
right,
for her healing and for her soul and everything.
Yeah, so people don't know what they're messing with. But then you see, so Tim, I think, said he was overseas for maybe 3 months, and then he came back to the States, and he was pretty wiped out and missing his family, and that's where God says, hey, I've got one more assignment for you. I need you to go to Jekyll Island, Georgia. And he's like, what is there, Lord? I know I'm pretty tired, but and God's telling him the timing of this is important. I need you to do this one more thing, and we're kind of running out of time for this episode, so we'll save a lot of this for next time. But let's just start by saying he goes down to Georgia. He goes to Jekyll Island, and he doesn't know a whole lot of the history. Like, he knows some of the financial ties to our banking system from there at this point, but he doesn't know a whole lot of the history, and he certainly doesn't know why he's being sent down there. And so he has a very interesting interaction with the lady at the hotel there, and she says, "Are you Tim?" And she's able to figure out that he was the last guy to check in that day, so she knew she was expecting him. But she had this feeling like she wanted to say something more, and Tim kind of prodded it out of her, and that's where they kind of figured out that, hey, I felt like I was supposed to give you a couple nights here. I booked you a second night for free, and I set up a meeting with this museum curator, the museum that we have here on Jekyll Island, and you can spend almost the whole day with him tomorrow. And that's where it gets really interesting. Talking.
So
yeah.
I just want to say this. So Tim, obviously, as a man of God, is a sensitive spiritual man of God, walking in obedience. He was getting directions from the Lord, which was really, really cool to partner with the Lord in that regard. Now you're right in describing the story. The woman at the counter there at the hotel, she was a believer, but maybe hadn't exercised that gifting, that sensitivity to know that the Lord is speaking to her. But she was a pawn that the Lord used to direct Tim's steps, and very, very interesting that she did. And one of the things that you didn't say, which if people were to listen to the interview. It's definitely a must listen to hear it from their mouths, from his mouth, all the details. But the key part was, remember what room she put him in?
Oh, right. The presidential suite that had just been remodeled.
Nobody had used that room since back in the early 1900s, right? And a president was there. But the fact that here is this servant of the Lord representing the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords here on this planet, being given the presidential suite. So it was like, I don't think he ever said there was. I was waiting for, there's something hidden in that room, like there's something artifact.
Right.
But it wasn't so much what was in the room. It was the Lord honoring him as a servant.
Yeah, as an ambassador.
Yeah, as an ambassador to
the King of
himself,
Kings. Right.
The King of Kings, and giving him. And she's like, you don't look presidential. I looked you up. I don't know that you represent any country. It's like, I represent a country, that you know not of.
Yes, something beyond.
So I thought that was like an extra little blessing that the Lord gave him, but also let him know that he was, being used. Just another little something. I don't know. I liked that. The presidential suite.
I agree. I think that was a blessing for his faithfulness in responding to God, and we see that pattern in Scripture too, when things aren't always spelled out, but people are faithful to the revelation that God gives them, and they walk through that door to greater revelation. So why don't we wrap up today? We'll call this part 1. How about? And we will get into the mysteries of Jekyll Island and how that connects to the Federal Reserve and Canaanite altars. So we'll kind of save that as a little bit of a teaser for next time, since we laid the groundwork for the kind of the spiritual significance of these altars and the willingness to break boundaries towards sin, and how that invites spiritual powers, and how Tim was used of God to deal with that, and how it ties into our modern day banking system. And really, there's also some really interesting history that Dr. Laura Sanger brings up with Jekyll Island, having to do with slavery. And so there's a lot of correlation between, our banking system, debt, and slavery. Those things are very connected in God's eyes as far as how he sees those. So wrap it up for now.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, we'll get into part 2 next week, and we'll see if Don can join us then, and we'll continue on. Sounds good?
That'll work.
All right.
Talk to you later.
You've been listening to the Days of Noah podcast. Thanks for tuning in again today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Pass it along to your family and friends to help grow the channel. Don't forget to come back next week as we pick it up with part 2 of Tim Bence's story and how he dealt with Canaanite altars right here in the USA in Jekyll Island, Georgia, and how that was the birthplace of our very own Federal Reserve banking system. As always, feel free to reach out to us at the Days of Noah podcast at gmail.com with any questions, comments, or ideas or suggestions for the show. We appreciate each and every one of you listening, so thanks for just being a part of this journey with us. God bless, and see you next week.